Welcome to JHart Modelworks. In this video, we're getting started on the Revell 70 Challenger for the Blue Ox Model Shop Street Machine group build. Specifically, we're going to knock out all the prep work to get the body ready for paint. Welcome to my workbench. Let's get started. Alright guys, we're going to start with the hood, and there's a surprising amount of work to do just on the hood alone. First off, we're going to go ahead and get the parts off the sprue and get all these nub marks removed and cleaned up and sanded. The hood has these arms that go down into the body, and then on the very bottom there's these little hooks on the end. I want to be able to remove my hood, so I'm cutting these off and sanding these smooth. I'll still have the side arms so everything will line up properly, but I'll be able to remove it easily for shows. All of the chrome line on this body is like nearly non-existent. We need to rescribe all of it. We're going to start with the gum primer needle tip scriber and their marking tape to get the line started. Then we can follow back up with the Tamiya engraving tool to get a nice trim line. Be careful though, and don't go completely through the plastic. It is kind of thin. Now that that front trim has been rescribed, we're going to set about removing the molded in hood pins. We want to be really careful here because there are some body lines in this hood, and we don't want to sand those smooth. We also don't want to angle or push down too hard on the edge of the hood and accidentally maybe reshape the side profile of that hood. Now the hood and the intake have several of these raised ejector pins, and you may not care about them. Some people just leave the hood on their car all the time. When I go to shows, I like to take the hood off. So I'm going to come in with a set of chisels, and I'm going to chisel out that raised ejector pin, and then I'm going to come back in with some sanders and sand those smooth. I'm going to do the same thing on the underside of the hood for those pin marks as well, and if necessary, maybe fill some with some CA glue. Now we're going to go ahead and glue the intake onto the body of the hood, and I'm going to put some Tamiya Extra Thin all the way around the hood and the bottom of the intake. We'll then meet those together and press them in real good, and we'll let that sit for a little bit. And when it's dry, we're going to notice that there's a really bad seam between the intake and the body of the hood. We want to take care of this. There's a couple of ways we can do it. We could use CA glue, we could use putty. I am just going to sand it smooth as best as I can using some of the Display sanding sponge. I'm then going to add another coat of the Tamiya Extra Thin over it and let that sit for a couple of minutes, but not until it's all the way cured, just enough to soften the plastic. So we're going to apply a liberal amount just to the seams between the intake and the hood here. And then after that's softened up a bit, we're going to sand it again to try and work down this softer plastic. It'll speed up the smoothing process a little bit. Now we're going to do this several times, and we're not going to remove the dust from the seams because that dust is going to melt down as a filler, almost like you're using sprue glue without pre-mixing it. So just sand it, apply more Tamiya Extra Thin, sand it some more, apply some more Tamiya Extra Thin. We're going to do this several times, but we will eventually end up with a really nice, really smooth, solid piece of plastic with no dividing line. The hood has two little bumps on it for the washer fluid sprayers, and we're going to go ahead and mark them, and then we're going to sand the tops off, and that's going to give us a really nice indicator for where those are at so that we can come back in with a dead center tool to form a pilot point and then drill them out with a 1/2 millimeter drill bit. Once we have the holes drilled, we can then just sand smooth any residual remaining bits of the kit bumps. So we hit the hood with some Mr. Surfacer 1500 black. We're going to leave it that black, and off camera I did the chrome trim with some bare metal foil. Now we're going to go back in and replace those hood pins with some ProTech Photo Etch hood pins. I'm using a ball of blue tack to hold the hood pin here, and just put a tiny drop of super glue on the bottom and then carefully set them where I want them onto the hood. Alright, final step for the hood, we're going to put the washer nozzles back. We're going to use some Elmer's glue and some Top Studios 0.8mm rivets for this. We're going to place the head of the rivet onto a toothpick with some tape twisted so the sticky side is out. Dip the rivet in the glue, and then after about 20 tries, we can set the rivet into place in the holes that we drilled earlier. Once we have them in place, we can clean off any excess glue with a wet cotton bud, and then presto, we have washer nozzles and a completed hood. Just like on the hood, all the chrome trim on the body is very shallow, and the panel lines for things like the doors and the trunk need some love too. So we're going to very carefully rescribe them with the gum primer pin scriber and the Tamiya engraver. We want to take our time on this and go really slow, otherwise we'll jump out and we'll cause a lot of excess work trying to clean up the scratches on the body. So it may look like I'm going super fast here. In fact, this whole video is going to look like I'm moving very quickly. I speed everything in the video up by at least 200%. Just so this doesn't turn into like a several hour long video, because no one really wants to watch me sand and scribe for 3 hours. Now, I find that the gum primer pin scribing tool is a lot better for getting around these little corners like this. Sometimes I still find that I need to use some of their masking tape, which is really like it's a thick tape. It's like a guide that you can use to just run the pin scribe against so that you don't jump out, and you can follow that to make your line. So after I have everything rescribed, I like to hit everything with some Tamiya panel line accent color. And what this does for me is if I've gone out of the lines and I don't realize it, that panel line is going to make a black line that's going to run off into the body, and I can clearly see that I need to go back and fill and sand and clean that up. Next up are mold seams. The kit has them. They aren't super bad, but you can definitely feel a sharp ridge right along the tops of the fenders. So we're going to clean these up with a 400 grit sponge sander. We don't want to change the shape of the fender lines. We just want to remove that sharp, jagged edge where the two molds parted when they were pouring the kit. So we're going to go ahead and glue the front and rear valances to the body, but first we need to clean up the sprue points. We also are going to drill out the lock for the trunk. We're going to replace this during final assembly with a 1.2mm rivet from Top Studio. So we want to take our dead center tool, but we want to make absolutely certain that we are center in where that lock is at. Then we can go back in and drill in with our 0.5mm drill bit to open that up. These two tiny little bumps back here just give you something to push that up against so that you know you've got it located properly. The bottom doesn't have any real good locating, you just make sure you get it in as flush as possible, and then we're going to hit it with some Tamiya extra thin all around. Just to give it a little bit more structural rigidity, I'm going to put some CA glue in the joint back behind where the rear valance and the fender meet. And that is going to lead us to these nasty seams on the corners. Alright, to fill the seams, we're going to put a very thin bead of CA glue all the way along the seam. You don't want to make this too thick or it won't actually cure through, and then when you sand it, you're going to sand away all of the glue. So we want to keep it thin, let it cure all the way, or use some Insta-Set and let that sit to make sure it cures all the way. Then sand it as smooth as you can, reapply and resand. You may have to do this several times. On the front seams for this car, I had to fill those 4 or 5 times before I got those completely filled. After each attempt to fill it, we'll give it the old fingernail test, and once it's smooth to the touch, we'll hit it with some primer to check for issues. Primer will show a lot of stuff that you won't see or feel over this bright white plastic. There is also a gap in the corner up at the top of the rear end. Now I want to be a lot more precise with the CA glue application, so I'm going to use a very thin piece of jewelry wire to just pick up some glue and put it right in that corner. We'll then hit that with some Insta-Set, and we're going to roll up some sandpaper so that we can get real tight into that edge and get that smoothed out. Catching little things like this is going to make a huge impact on the finished product of the model. Now there are some areas where we're not going to mess with it, such as the area right there where that bumper sits. You're not going to see it, it's going to be covered with the bumper. But something like this is very visible. Just like with the washer fluid nozzles, there is a raised bump for the antenna, and we sprayed it with some primer, and we're going to remove the top of it again, just like we did with the washer fluid nozzles. That's going to give us a pinpoint location for us to come in with our dead center tool to create a pilot hole, and we can then drill that out with our 0.5 millimeter drill bits. While working on the rear end, you may have noticed a bit of aluminum up here where the battery used to be. That's because we cut that battery out, and we're going to do the same thing with this washer fluid bottle up here. We're going to start out with the Tamiya engraver, and we're going to go in and we're going to scribe deeply, as deep as we can, a line all the way around this washer fluid bottle. Every edge where we want to cut, we want a nice deep line. These are the Tamiya Photo Etch saw blades. I have them stuck in some terrible cheap hobby knife handles, and I hate these things because they are so thin, they bend and they bind and they kink up. The thing that makes me hate these so much is the thing that's going to make these perfect for cutting this detail out, and that's the reason why I keep them around. They are thin and they are flexible, and they will follow that deep line we just scribed in without binding up too much, as long as we don't flex them too much. So let's work back and forth between various different cuts, take a little bit at a time, and eventually we can cut it loose and pop out that detail without too much damage to the body. This is a tool that I created, and I created it specifically for sanding something like this. This is a small area sanding tool, and it's really good for areas where I can't get a big sander like this into and get it to go down flat. I can just put a 4x4 millimeter of adhesive sandpaper, like the display sandpaper, on the end of this, and I can reach down in like I'm sanding with a pen. It works really well. I was really happy with it. I have actually printed some of these out. I am considering selling these. I have this one that is flat, and there's another one that's rounded, so for doing things like the exhaust pipes. So stay tuned. There will likely be another video with more information on these tools. I managed to print 7 of each of them up before catastrophe struck, and I cracked the screen on my 3D printer, and now I'm kind of dead in the water on this build until I can get a new screen in, and they're saying it might be a month. But that is pretty clean. So now that we've got the washer fluid bottle removed and we've got the hole cleaned up, we need to fill it. Leave it to me to misuse my own tool. I'm going to put some Tamiya tape down here, and then I'm going to tamp it down nice and smooth, and we're going to use this to draw up a template. Once we have our template drawn up, we're going to transfer that over to some soda can aluminum, and we're going to cut out the patch that we're going to use to fill the hole. Now, I'm going to use a photo etch bender to put a 90-degree bend in this. If you don't have a photo etch bender, use some flat nose pliers. It'll do just as well. Once we have it cut out and bent, we're going to go ahead and glue it into place. Just add a little bit of CA glue here, and then we'll use some nice tweezers to set it down and press everything home. And that takes care of that. The front turn signals are molded in white plastic down in the bottom corners, lenses and all. I don't care for that, so we're going to remove them and replace them later in final assembly. Step 1, get the dead center tool, get as close to the very center as possible, and make a pilot hole. Step 2, start drilling holes. We're going to start with a small bit, something like maybe 1 millimeter, and we're going to step through like maybe 0.2 of a millimeter at a time, drilling and drilling and drilling until we get it all the way through. Like my largest micro bit is a 3 millimeter. We're then going to use a round file to file out as much of this as we can. And then we're going to hit this with what is essentially a 4 millimeter drill bit. It's the largest bit that will actually fit in my pin vise. But that's okay, because 4 millimeters is exactly the size we want. Once we get that filled, we're going to clean it out with a round file and it will be good to go. How are we going to fill them? Well, I have modeled and 3D printed some replacements. These are currently available on my Colts 3D store page. I have a link to all my designs in the description below. If you have a 3D printer, you can buy these and print your own. If you don't, I believe Colts now has a printing service where they will print and ship them to you. I don't know what the fees are for that. As for the lights themselves, I have 3 shapes for the casing. There is this cylinder-shaped bucket, which is meant to slide in from the front. There is also this round casing, which also is meant to slide in from the front. And there's this same round casing, but it has a 0.5 millimeter lip around it. And this is good for gluing in from behind. The lip gives you a good surface to glue to so it doesn't go through. I've also made a lens part, so if you have some clear resin, you can 3D print lenses as well. If you don't have clear 3D resin, you can also just use some Bondic, or maybe even get away with using some CA glue and some Instaset. Next, we're going to take a serrated bladed hobby saw blade, and we're going to start cutting the front clip in half. Now, we're not going to go all the way through. We're not going to cut it completely in half yet. Like I discussed in the unboxing, the top half of the front clip needs to remain black. There's some chrome trim, there's some silver that needs to get in there, but the bottom needs to be body color. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the saw blade, and we're going to start cutting kind of like we're using the scriber right along the underside of where the bumper meets the front clip. And that's going to create a crease. And then we're going to take this super thin Tamiya blade, you know, the ones that I hate. Yeah, we're going to use these yet again. And we're going to start cutting our way through the front end. But we don't want to cut all the way through. We don't want these parts completely separated just yet. What we are going to do is we're going to slowly work back and forth. We're going to cut all the way through in the middle, but we're going to leave it connected on the right and left side. I got it bound up and kinked. I'm going to have to straighten it back out. Always having to straighten this one back out. So we're going to stop cutting through right about here, and then we're just going to use that saw blade a little bit more on the front. We want to make this thin. We want to make it so that it's easy to cut once we get the front end glued into place. Alright, once we have it nice and thin, we're going to go ahead and set it into place. And we're going to glue the front clip to the body with some Tamiya extra thin so that we get it nice and well bonded together. Very important, do not glue the upper half of the front clip to the body, just the bottom. Alright, we're going to glue the other side into place as well. Make sure everything is lined up and get it pressed home. And then we're going to add a little bit of Tamiya extra thin to the outside as well. Don't worry about the body, we're going to end up sanding the crap out of all of this anyhow. Once we have it glued into place, notice we did not glue the upper half. We can come back in with our saw blade and we can cut loose the ends with that thin part that we left just barely connected, and we can pop it out. With the upper half removed, we can sand off any ejector pin marks, and we want to put a slight bevel in the bottom of the front side of the clip. This way when we go to put it back, it'll slide back in a little easier and won't hang up as much on the lower half of the front end. Don't take off too much though, because we still need something to mount into place. Speaking of which, next we're going to take some of this very thin styrene strip from Evergreen and we're going to cut off 2 small pieces. Hopefully they don't, all fly away like that. Next, we want to cut a notch out of 1 corner on each of these pieces. This is going to help these fit around the turn signal area that we have in the front clip. We're going to glue these to the back of the lower portion of the front clip where it meets at the top to create a support for the upper half when we put it back in later for final assembly. So we got our support piece placed mostly where we want it. We're going to add some Tamiya extra thin to it. But before that has a chance to set, we're going to come back in and move it exactly where we want it. Once we get it where we want it, we can go ahead and leave it in place and let that dry. And we'll go ahead and add a little bit of Tamiya extra thin to the front as well, just to make sure it has a nice, good bond. Now when I went to go do the other side, I thought to myself, hey, why even bother with trying to set it into place? Get the Tamiya extra thin in first, and then just slide it where you want it from the front. And that was way easier. Finally, we're going to sand off any rough edge from here, but be very gentle. No pressure, just the weight of the sander. Any more pressure and you're going to snap this thing in half. I have let the Tamiya extra thin cure for a couple of hours because I want it to be fully cured before we start messing with it. Now, because of how close these front side markers are that are molded into the body to these nasty seams we're fixing to have to do a lot of sanding on, I'm going to take some Tamiya tape and I'm going to mask over them to protect them from the sanding sticks. Once those are masked off and protected, just like we did on the rear panel, We're going to put a very thin bead of CA glue over these seams and let it dry, or we'll hit it with some Instaset and let that cure up and dry, and then you can start sanding it. If you need to, you can add more CA glue and let that dry and then sand it some more and just keep building up layers until you finally have it like sanded and filled smooth. Like I said earlier, I had to fill and sand these front seams several times. I think one side I had to fill like 4 or 5 times before I finally got it filled enough to hit it with some primer for a test shot. If I remember correctly, I may have even had to have sanded and filled it again after I shot it with primer because it wasn't done yet. It took several tries. These seams are really nasty. I forget which side it is. One of these sides, I actually took some of that strip styrene that we cut earlier, and I cut a small piece and added it to the back side of the seam with some Tamiya Extra Thin just to reinforce the plastic, because that seam kind of felt a little weak where I was pushing and sanding on it so much. Alright, with that front clip done, we can move on to the mirrors. I still have them on the sprue. It makes them a little easier to handle, and we're using our dead center tool, and we're going to start a pilot hole, but we want to make sure that we are perfectly centered front to back and side to side and angled correctly so that we go straight up the arm. We don't want to be drilling and come out the side and create a nasty hole. So we just want to drill our 1/2 millimeter drill bit straight up the arm. We don't have very far that we can go. We just want to get enough of a hole in there that we can glue a metal pin into. Now while you're drilling it, keep turning it, keep checking the direction, and keep making sure that you are still centered in that arm. Once we have the hole drilled, we're going to go ahead and sand the bottom smooth again. And then we're going to take some of this 1/2 millimeter hard wire and we're going to glue that into the bottom of the mirror. Once it's glued in, we'll cut the mirror off the spool. And I like to cut it long so I can hold the wire between the cut and the mirror. This relieves the cutting stress so it doesn't shoot up into the mirror and break the wire loose. Then we're going to go ahead and use our sander and just clean up any of the nub marks and just make sure the mirror is nice and smooth. Now we're going to line the mirror up on the body and we're going to use a marker to put a small dot on the body where we want to drill. Now for those of you who think that this looks way far back, I'm right there with you. But I checked a bunch of different sources for a bunch of different reference pics and they all show this mirror lining up pretty much with the top of the angle of the A-pillar, so that's where I put it. Also, when we're drilling, notice I'm drilling down at an angle. This is the angle that the pin is going to sit in the body so that the mirror itself will sit flush against the base of the car. If you just drill straight into the body with the angle that the pin is glued in, it's going to make the mirror sit funny. Alright, we're going to do a test fit to make sure everything sits well, and while we actually have it in place, we'll go ahead and use our marker and kind of mark on the inside on the metal pin where we want to make a cut, and we'll just cut off the excess metal pin. This way, when we get to final assembly, there will just be a small bit of metal nub sticking through that we can glue from the inside, and there won't be a lot of excess in there to interfere with the fit for the interior tub. Now, our final prep step is to go ahead and key this whole body up with some Tamiya 1000 grit sponge. I used to use the 600. I used to watch Tom from the Scale Modeling channel. He used the 600, and I found, especially on candy jobs, this isn't going to be a candy job, but I did find on candy jobs the 600 leaves some deep scratches, and those scratches can sometimes show up through your silver base coat and mess up your candy. I like to use the 1000 on like standard color coats, and for candies I like using the 3000. We're not sanding nearly enough to remove any detail off the body. You really just want to scuff up the body a little bit. You want to take the shine off the plastic. Once the plastic's no longer shiny, you're pretty much done keying it up. From here, we're going to wipe the body down with some alcohol, or we'll wash it with a degreaser like Dawn dish soap, and that is going to wrap it up for this video. I know it was a long one, and it wasn't the most exciting. It was just a lot of prep work. But there was a lot I wanted to go over, and there were several things like modifying that front end and filling those seams that we don't usually have to do, and I wanted to make sure they got covered. Also, honestly, the prep work is really the most important part of your paint job. It may not be as exciting as seeing color go down, but if the prep work isn't done well, you end up having issues with the paint. As always, guys, I appreciate you watching the video. Thank you for taking your time to hang out and build with me, and I will catch you on the next one.